Welcome to the War Report. In this episode, we will be covering the top 10 German generals of World War II. Coming in at number 10 is General Heinz Guderian. General Guderian served as an infantry and staff officer during World War I, but early in his post-war career, he specialized in mechanized warfare. In 1922, he joined the Army Transport Department of Defense Ministry and by 1934 was Chief of Staff of the Armored Corps Command. He published his theories of armored warfare in a book, Achtung Panzer, in 1937. His revolutionary tactics of blitzkrieg warfare echo the dynamism and aggression of Nazi ideology and were to provide an ideal tool for Hitler's war plans. Its efficiency was revealed in the German victories of 1939 and 1940, which Guderian commanded 19th Corps in the invasions of Poland and France. His armored thrust at Sedan proved crucial to the campaign's success, and he pressed on to the Channel coast. Although he enjoyed further good fortune during the invasion of Russia in 1941, he clashed once again with the High Command. He criticized their failure to exploit the initial success, and on December 26, 1941, was relieved of his command. However, Guderian returned in February 1943 when he was appointed inspector of panzer troops. He continued to oppose Hitler on many issues, but was nevertheless made Chief of the General Staff on July 21, 1944. However, there was little he could do to alter the Führer's orders, and he had little control over the disposition of German forces. On March 28, 1945, he argued once too often and was sent on convalescent leave. He was captured by American forces on May 10, 1945, and became a memorist, but he left out his war crimes. Coming in at number 9, we have General der Panzertruppen, Lieutenant General Hasso Eckhard Manteuffel. The effectiveness of this panzer general's hard-driving leadership and tactical ability was reflected in his rapid promotion from lieutenant colonel in 1939 to lieutenant general in 1944. Briefly a divisional commander in Tunisia, Manteuffel from mid-1943 commanded the 7th Panzer Division in Russia, stemming the Soviet advance at Berdichev and briefly recapturing Zhytomyr, November 19, 1943, during Manstein's southern counteroffensive. In late 1944, after leading Grossdeutschland Panzer Division in Romania and East Prussia, he took command of 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive, December 1944 to January 1945. Advancing on the northern flank of Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, Manteuffel forced the surrender of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division in the Schnee-Eifel, December 19th, and captured Saint-Vith, December 22nd. But the determined defense of Bastogne, shortage of fuel, slowed his thrust towards the Meuse. Early in March 1945, he was rushed to take over 3rd Panzer Army in Army Group Vistula, facing the northern Soviet advance on Berlin with what he called a ghost army. Most tanks had gone to meet Zhukov's southern offensive. Manteuffel staunchly contested Rokossovsky's advance until late April. Then he retreated swiftly, surrendering to the U.S. 8th Infantry Division on May 3rd. At number 8, we have Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of U-boats and leader of the German Navy during World War II. In 1914, he was a lieutenant on Breslau, accompanying Goeben in her escape to Turkey. In 1918, he commanded the submarine U-68 in the Mediterranean and was taken prisoner when she was sunk. Between the wars, Donitz helped to develop the anti-submarine school, clandestinely training submarine crews. Soon after the existence of the U-boat arm was officially admitted in 1935, Donitz became its commander, shaped it in accord with his ideas on Wolfpack attacks, controlled from shore headquarters. Using the cover of darkness to enable U-boats to act as surface torpedo boats. These tactics would provide superb initial results, but would eventually prove vulnerable to Allied countermeasures. Central control required much use of radio by the submarines, which became a fatal weakness in the face of Allied direction finding and decrypting. He entered World War II with only 57 operational submarines, far too few for the purpose of sustained attack on British trade. He believed in a protracted struggle, placing a considerable proportion of his resources on training. At first, only a few U-boats could be maintained on patrol in the Atlantic. The position was greatly improved by the capture of bases in Norway and France in 1940, and the happy time followed. With the available U-boats achieving high scores, a seesaw struggle followed, and in early 1943 it seemed that the convoy system was crumbling under Wolfpack attacks. But by the summer, the U-boats were defeated. Donitz was now head of the Navy, replacing Raeder in January 1943. He managed to persuade Hitler to rescind his order to get rid of the surface fleet, as well as shooting at survivors of sunken ships. His main hopes were pinned on the new types of submarine, which in the event appeared too late. Donitz was a fervent Nazi, and Hitler bequeathed the headship of the state to him. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment at Nuremberg. At number 7, we have Obergruppenführer SS, or Colonel General Paul Hauser. A World War I veteran, Hauser retired from the Reichswehr as a lieutenant general in 1932. He soon joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, playing a major part under Himmler in its development in 1934 to 39 into the Waffen-SS. He commanded the 2nd Waffen-SS Das Reich Division in France 1940 and 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the Eastern Front, transferring with it to the west following the Normandy invasion. On June 28, 1944, he became commander of 7th Army, bitterly contesting the Allies' Normandy breakout. From early 1945, he commanded Army Group G in its final resistance on the Rhine and in the Ruhr. During the Nuremberg trials, he was found guilty of no war crimes except SS membership, which the Nuremberg trial had found to be a criminal organization. At number 6, we have Feldmarschall Theodor von Bock. The son of a Prussian general, Bock spent the early part of World War I on general staff duties, but commanded a Foot Guards battalion on the Western Front in 1917-18, winning Imperial Germany's highest gallantry award, the Pour le Mérite. Continuing to rise in his profession, he led the German forces which occupied Austria in 1938. Haughty, humorless, and ambitious, Bock despised the Nazis but was prepared to support Hitler as long as the army was strengthened and his own career flourished. He commanded Army Group North in Poland and in 1940 commanded Army Group B in the West, overrunning the Low Countries and northwestern France. Promoted to Feldmarschall after the French campaign, he led Army Group Center in the invasion of Russia. In 1941, normally an industrious rather than an inspired commander, Bock nevertheless encircled and destroyed several Soviet armies at Minsk, Smolensk, and Gomel. but was robbed by Hitler's untimely transfer of Panzer units to the north and south in August. When the drive on Moscow resumed, it ground to a halt in the Russian winter, and Bock, suffering from ulcers, was relieved of command on December 18th. A month later, he was given command of Army Group South, only to be removed in July 1942, following strategic disagreements with Hitler. He was killed in an Allied air attack. Number 5. Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe in 1936, Commander Luftflotte 1 in the Polish campaign of 1939, Commander Luftflotte 2 in the invasion of France and the Battle of Britain in 1940, and in the invasion of Russia in 1941. When Hitler decided to intervene again in the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1941, Luftflotte 2 was redeployed to Italy, and Kesselring was appointed Commander-in-Chief South, with the task of establishing Axis naval and air superiority over supply routes to North Africa. His responsibilities were progressively widened, and he became all but Commander-in-Chief of Axis forces in the Mediterranean, which were nominally under Italian command. After the fall of Mussolini and the Allied invasion of Italy, he proposed defending Italy as far south as possible, contrary to Rommel, who advocated withdrawal to the Pisa-Rimini line in the northern Apennines. Hitler sided with Rommel initially, but changed his mind when Kesselring managed to slow the Allies' advance north from Naples and authorized him to stand on the Gustav line. Kesselring defeated Alexander at Anzio and Cassino early in 1944, but was decisively defeated by Alexander in the Diadem offensive in May, and was forced to abandon Rome and withdraw to the Gothic line. When that line was breached by the Allies in the autumn, he advocated withdrawal to the Alps, but Hitler refused. Nevertheless, he managed to hold the Allies in the northern Apennines until spring of 1945. On March 10, 1945, Hitler made him Commander-in-Chief West, with the impossible task of preventing the Anglo-American forces overrunning the Reich from the west. After the war, he was found guilty by the War Crimes Tribunal in Venice of atrocities against Italian partisans. The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1952. Coming in at number 4, we have Feldmarschall Walter Model. Served during World War I on the Western Front and on the General Staff. A staff officer early in World War II, not until the invasion of the Soviet Union was he fully able to display his talents as a brave, energetic, and tactically astute commander, leading 3rd Panzer Division to major successes at Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. This resulted in a meteoric rise to command of the 9th Army in January 1942. A loyal servant of Hitler, Model was nevertheless prepared to back his own judgment against the Führer's interference. Unusually, this attitude was respected, especially as he continued to achieve success early in 1942 with the Battle of Rzhev. His failure in Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk, summer 1943, was to great extent offset by the need for his defensive qualities in meeting the Soviet counterattack. In January 1944, Model was appointed Commander-in-Chief, Army Group North, to check the seemingly inexorable advance of the Red Army, and instituted a policy of Schild und Schwert, or shield and sword, consisting of systematic withdrawal followed by counterattack. His reputation as a troubleshooter earned him the nickname the Führer's Fireman, and by the end of June he had been given command of Army Group South and Center. Having stabilized the Eastern Front, albeit on the East Prussian border, Morden was next sent to France as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B and OB West. Morden could do little but try to extricate his troops. In September, he was replaced as OB West by von Rundstedt. Morden achieved one more victory against the Allied airborne forces at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, but his participation in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944 and the defenses of the Ruhr in the spring of 1945 were, by his standards, failure. Finally, with defeat inevitable, Model committed suicide on April 21st, 1945, to ensure he didn't fall into the Russian hands and the war crimes they believe he committed. Coming in at number 3 is the famous Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel. Came to Hitler's attention as commander of 7th Panzer Division in the invasion of France in June 1940, appointed to command the Afrika Corps. He landed at Tripoli in February 1941 with the task of stopping the British conquest of Libya. Despite High Command's objections, he invaded Cyrenaica in April 1941, driving the British back. He defeated 2 attempts to relieve Tobruk in the summer of 1941, but was himself defeated by 8th Army during its Crusader offensive in November 1941, and was forced to raise the siege of Tobruk. He withdrew into Tripolitania to await tank replacements. Nevertheless, his operations in the Western Desert earned him the title of the Desert Fox. In January 1942, he counterattacked, driving 8th Army back towards Tobruk. In the Battle of Gazala in June, he won tank superiority, took Tobruk, and advanced to El Alamein. Promoted Feldmarschall, he was then decisively defeated by General Montgomery at Alam Helfa and El Alamein that autumn, and was forced to withdraw to Tunisia. He was again defeated by Montgomery at Medellin, leaving Africa in March 1943 due to ill health and intrigue in the Axis High Command. As commander of Army Group B, he occupied northern Italy when the Badoglio government capitulated in September 1943, and 3 months later was made responsible for the defense of the Channel coast in anticipation of the Allied invasion of Western Europe. He advocated a policy of forward defense because his experience in Africa persuaded him that it would be impractical to move armored formations in daylight under conditions of Allied air supremacy. Von Rundstedt and Guderian took the contrary view. In the event, German panzer formations were committed piecemeal and failed to destroy the Allies' beachhead in June 1944. By the beginning of July, Rommel and von Rundstedt were trying to persuade Hitler to withdraw to the Seine. Rommel was seriously injured on July 15th when his car was attacked by Allied fighters just 2 days before the abortive attempt on Hitler's life. Implicated in the plot, he was forced to take his own life on October 1944. In World War I, he took thousands of Italian prisoners with just a handful of men and was awarded the highest Imperial German medal, the Pour le Mérite. Apparently, some war crimes were committed in North Africa by the SS, but Rommel, leading from the front, may have only just signed a document quickly trying to get the war won, as he only had 2 divisions and most of his infantry was made up of Italians. But regardless, war crimes did happen in North Africa, where he was commander-in-chief of the Deutsche Afrika Korps. Coming in at number 2, we have Feldmarschall Garrett von Rundstedt. During World War I, Rundstedt served on both the Eastern and Western fronts in staff and frontline posts. He remained in the army throughout the interwar years, developing a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards the Nazis. He approved of their strengthening of the armed forces, but was openly critical of their ruthless treatment of his contemporaries, von Blomberg and von Fritsch. In 1938, he retired, but with the invasion of Poland, returned to active service, helping prepare the attack and commanding Army Group South during the campaign. In 1940, his Army Group A delivered the unexpected blow in the Ardennes that turned the tide of the Battle of France. He was promoted Feld Marshal in July 1940, and in 1941 was made Commander-in-Chief, Army Group South for Barbarossa. Although doubting the wisdom of the attack, Rundstedt managed to get the best out of a multinational force, including Germans, Hungarians, Slovakians, Romanians, and Italians. However, by winter, he needed to withdraw some of his units, but was refused permission by Hitler and relieved of his command on December 1st, 1941. In March 1942, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief West with the task of securing Western Europe against Allied invasion. His clash with Rommel, his younger subordinate, over defensive strategy contributed to the poorly coordinated response to Operation Overlord. Rundstedt was once again relieved of his command, but was quickly recalled as Commander-in-Chief West. Nominally, he led the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944, but although it was known at the time as the Rundstedt Offensive, it was Hitler's scheme, and von Rundstedt had little faith in its success. The vindication of his doubts did not prevent him from a further dismissal, and he held no further command. And finally, at number 1, we have a field marshal who was considered by his peers to be the one who solved the most solutions to the most problems at the front. And that's the one and only Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Eminent strategist and field commander of World War II, he was von Rundstedt's chief of staff in Poland. September 1939, transferring with his chief to the Western Front in October. Opposing Oberkommand Heer's plan for the invasion of France, Case Yellow, he proposed instead a sudden armored thrust through the Ardennes, followed by a drive to the Channel to divide the Allied armies. Although this plan was adopted by Hitler, Manstein himself, having aroused the ire of Oberkommand, was relegated to command of 38th Corps. His brilliant handling of 51st Panzer Corps in Barbarossa, advancing 200 miles in 4 days, June 22nd to 26, 1941, brought him command of 11th Army in its successful Crimean campaign, September 1941 to July 1942, culminating in the capture of Sevastopol after a 250-day siege. As Commander-in-Chief, Army Group Dawn, November to December 1942, he failed to relieve Stalingrad. Hampered by Hitler's interference and policies of vacillation, but preserved sufficient forces on the German right to launch Army Group South's counteroffensive of February-March 1942, recapturing Kharkov against massive odds and temporarily stabilizing the front along the Donets. Hitler's refusal to allow an early assault on the Kursk salient, however, allowed the Russians to establish numerical superiority there. Manstein's penetration of July 5th to 10th, 1943 was achieved at high cost, and he was driven back. Manstein's mastery of mobile warfare was now manifested in his fighting retreat across the Dnieper River and into the Ukraine. But although his mobile defense, giving ground in order to build up for counterattacks, inflicted severe losses on the advancing Soviets, it conflicted with Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs. And on March 30th, 1944, Manstein was permanently removed from command. Post-war, he underwent 4 years imprisonment for war crimes and then joined the newly formed German Bundeswehr. So this has been the top 10 list of the German generals during World War II. Do you agree, or do you think someone else should make the list?